All right, investigators are seeking answers concerning simultaneous outages that affected a number of major websites early this morning. Affected websites included Amazon, Twitter, the New York Times, no great loss there, the White House, the British government, and more. Again, the sites all went down at the same time. Some have speculated the outage was due to a glitch in a service provider, while others are considering the more troubling possibility of a well-orchestrated cyber attack. Now, this comes as the CEO of Colonial Pipeline, Joseph Blunt, was set to testify on Capitol Hill today about last month's cyber attack that crippled the Colonial Pipeline, creating panic and leaving millions on the East Coast without gas. Here's a clip from that hearing today.
I made the decision to pay, and I made the decision to keep the information about the payment as confidential as possible. It was the hardest decision I've made in my 39 years in the energy industry, and I know how critical our pipeline is to the country, and I put the interests of the country first.
Colonial paid a ransom of over $4 million, most of that being recovered by federal authorities. Joining me now to talk about this and how the Biden administration is handling these cyber attacks and to give us an update on the border crisis as well, former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump, Chad Wolf. He now serves as chair of the Center for Homeland Security and Immigration at the American First Policy Institute. Chad, welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks for having me, Tony. Appreciate being here.
All right, so let's talk about the reading that we've seen like a 600% spike in cyber crime, cyber attacks. A lot of people blaming it on the coronavirus. Of course, it's like global warming. Everything's something else is responsible for it. But could this actually be a testing of the Biden administration to see what their resolve is?
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of the attacks that we've seen recently, and I think it's important to remember, ransomware attacks really have increased exponentially over the last several years. But whether they come from nation state actors or non-state actors, I think they're both very troubling. And of course, our adversaries are going to continue to test this administration, particularly in its early months, on what is the response that this administration will have on these types of cyber attacks. So there's a variety of different things that I know the Biden administration is doing and probably should be doing more of. Particularly as it relates to Russia. We know particularly the cyber criminals that were behind the Colonial Pipeline, they reside in Russia, and whether they are operating from, backed by Russia, I think it's very important that we work with the Russian government to make sure that we hold them accountable at the end of the day.
Do you know how closely Russian officials are working with American officials right now to track down those individuals?
Well, my guess is that those discussions are ongoing, and we know that President Biden is going overseas in the next several weeks to have a summit, and we'll sit down with President Putin and others. So I know those discussions are ongoing. The question is what can be done about it at the end of the day. I think it was a positive step forward that we were able to seize some of the cryptocurrency that was used to pay out that Colonial Pipeline ransom. I think we need to do more of that. We need to give law enforcement more tools. We also need to look at making sure that the IC and Cyber Command out of the Defense Department can also go after some of these non-state actors. I think we need to take the gloves off when it comes to these types of events, because what these events have shown us over the last several months is that they don't just affect private sector interest alone. They are targeting critical infrastructure, and they're having an impact on millions of Americans and the prosperity of our economy at the end of the day. And so that signifies to me that the federal government needs to play a larger role here in helping our private sector respond to these types of attacks.
Mr. Wolf, it seems like these are a little bit different than what we've seen in the last several years. I mean, this is not new, as you said. This has been happening. It's been ramping up. And we saw some attacks during the Trump administration actually going after some government entities. But I don't know. To me, this appears like they're going after critical infrastructure that affects the American public. I mean, they're going after the gas lines, the pipelines to affect our energy supply. This, coupled with the fact that this administration is pushing away from our natural gas, our natural resources production, but then going after the food supply. We had the meat industry targeted with these as well. I mean, these seem to be, to me, there's some kind of coordinated effort here to hurt the American public.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I think what's important to keep in mind is when we talk about cyber attacks, these happen thousands of times every day. And for the vast majority of those, we will never hear about them and the public will never hear about them. Unfortunately, to your point, Tony, though, they're becoming more emboldened here recently and really targeting critical infrastructure, such as the Colonial Pipeline, obviously the food industry. And even if we go back to 2020 and the attack on solar winds, that obviously targets a different part of our critical infrastructure. And so if we don't take some aggressive action now, I'm afraid, and I know others are as well, that this is going to continue and it's going to escalate in the years and really in the months to come. And so these folks need to be sent a signal that it's not okay for them to do it. It's not okay for them to hide behind whatever foreign entity, country, or state that is perhaps sponsoring them. Again, the gloves need to come off, and we need to send a signal to our adversaries or to these cyber criminals, and that it's not okay to attack this type of critical infrastructure.
I have my opinion on this question I'm about to ask you, but I think that many of these players were afraid to do this type of stuff when Donald Trump was president because they didn't quite know how he would respond.
Well, I think there's something to that. I think a lot of our adversaries, whether we're talking about in the cyberspace or we're talking more in your traditional battle space, kinetic, military, they're looking at the leadership of the American government and how they will respond. And they knew under President Trump that he would take bold and aggressive action to protect American interest at the end of the day, whether that was with our troops overseas or whether that was in cyberspace. And so I don't know that same signal is being sent by the current administration. And I think that's what our adversaries are testing out here in the early days.
Well, Mr. Wolf, I want you to stick around because we're going to talk about other signals this administration is sending when it pertains to the border. I know you spent a lot of time on the southern border when you were the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security addressing that issue, and it's a problem. It's a crisis, and I want to talk about what the administration needs to do to get this under control. Holding over from the last segment, former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. We've been discussing a stream of cyber attacks against major U.S. infrastructure, but I want to switch gears now, and I want to move to the issue of the border crisis. 76 days ago, in March 24th, the president put the Vice President Harris, in charge of the border crisis. Now, yesterday, she was on NBC, and Lester Holt asked her about when she planned on going to the border for the first time.
Okay.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't understand the point that you're making.
Well, I think I understand the point. If you're going to solve a problem, you need to go and look at the problem. Chad, for President Trump, the border was a big issue, and he tapped the Secretary of Homeland Security to address that issue. How many trips did you make to the southern border?
I made dozens of trips from Arizona to New Mexico to California to Texas, all along that southwest border, because it's critically important to understand the different environments down there. It's important to talk to the men and women of Border Patrol, the law enforcement officers that live in those communities, but go to work every day to understand what their threats, what they're seeing, to talk to the local law enforcement, talk to the local ranchers, the landowners there, as well as the other community services operating there. Not doing that, Vice President Harris is not fully really understanding the full breadth of what's going on at that border. To simply bypass that border or simply to fly over it as she goes to Guatemala as well as to Mexico, she needs to stop. She needs to understand what's going on there. As I've said, she went there as a senator. I believe she also went there as a candidate for the presidency. She should now go back as vice president. She has some authority now. She has some ability to make changes there. She needs to go to that border.
Well, the situation has changed dramatically since she was a candidate and since she was a senator. I was there at the border In fact, I think I made a couple of trips myself to the border. Last one about a year and a half ago, and it was like a ghost town on the border because the policies that the Trump administration had put in place were working. People were staying in Mexico instead of crossing over until they were being processed. So I think you're absolutely right. I think she needs to lay her eyes on it, talk to the people involved. I think that's the first step in trying to solve part of the problem. Now, the Biden administration, Department of Homeland Security, leaked a 46-page document to the New York Times outlining a comprehensive immigration plan that revolves around letting in more immigrants. How's that going to solve the problem?
Well, it's not at the end of the day, and we need to make sure that folks that are coming here are doing that through legal pathways. And there's a very different concept here by allowing individuals that have no legal right to come here, that are legally crossing that border to come into the country, to stay into the country. Instead, we need to make sure we put them in legal pathways. They're using ports of entry, and we have a process and orderly flow that to come into the United States. Look, we continue to be one of the most generous nations in the entire world, allowing individuals to come here, to stay here, to work here, to visit the United States. And we will continue to do that, but it must be orderly, it must be lawful, and there must be a process. And we have anything but that going on the border today. In fact, we have the exact opposite of that today. We're in our third month of over 170,000 illegal border crossings in 1 month, in one 30-day period, over 170,000. That is astronomically high, the highest that we've seen in over 21 years. And so the border continues to remain in a crisis, in flux. It's not under control, and there need to be changes there at the end of the day if we want to see this, if we want to see any type of change occur.
Chad, when you were Secretary of Homeland Security, you were tasked with keeping the Homeland secure. That was your primary responsibility. When you look at what is happening today, if you were Secretary, would you be concerned?
I would be concerned. Obviously, what's going on that border. And look, Tony, we had a crisis in 2019, and we talked about it very straightforward with the American people. We described it as a crisis. We described what was going on down there, how the cartels were using loopholes in our laws to bypass that border and to remain here. And that's what's not going on with this administration. They're not being straight with the American people and describing exactly what's going on there. They continue to use language like the border is closed, the border is secure. That is anything but the truth. When you have 178,000 folks come across that border in 1 month alone, illegally, and those are just the ones that we apprehend. There are thousands a day that we don't apprehend called gotaways, that we don't know who they are. We don't know if they are migrants seeking jobs. We don't know if they're criminals, if they're MS-13, or if worse, they're terrorists. At the end of the day, because we are overwhelmed, the system is broken on that border, thanks to the policies that have been enacted over the last 4.5 months.
Chad Wolf, we're out of time, but I want to thank you for being generous with your time. Always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right, thank you.